I've been teaching political communication since 2002, and I was 24 years old at the time. By then, what we thought we knew about media and politics hadn't really changed massively over the past 20 years. There had been some changes, CNN, the 24 hours news cycle, but there hadn't been massive changes. Also, by the time I started teaching, I felt I was really ahead of most of my students in terms of understanding what contemporary media were, and I felt that I knew more about things like the internet than most of my students did. Both of these things have changed massively over the last 15 years. Our students now use technologies and apps that most of us teachers don't, or only know but don't regularly use. And also the questions that people ask about our media and the dilemmas that we face in terms of the ways in which communication interacts with politics have changed dramatically and keep changing at the speed of light, really. If one thinks about what's happened in politics in the last just few years and what's happened in the ways in which we communicate about politics, the change has been massive. So a lot of colleagues in the profession have been saying that we need to embrace these difficulties. We shouldn't retract behind our theories and our research, which obviously takes a long time to develop and to implement and to communicate. But we should embrace the idea of teaching what we don't know as well as what we know. Now, how have I tried to take this on board in my teaching? After making sure that students have learned all the best research that we have in the field and all the theoretical thinking that has been going on in the field, trying to get them to get their hands dirty with practical cases that are contemporary and for which there might not be an easy and immediate answer in the books, but we can come up with an answer if we combine what we have in the books, what we have in our lectures and in our research, with critical understanding of everyday political realities. And so this is why in my seminar activities, instead of just having a general discussion about the readings, which can be useful of course, we work on case studies, and as much as possible I try to get the students immersed into the decision making that journalists and politicians do on a day-to-day basis with respect to those cases. So the basic structure would be either as individual activities that would then have a group discussion or as group exercises. But the main, the backbone of the seminar structure would be that I would briefly recap the main theoretical concepts and empirical evidence that we would need in order to do the activity proficiently. And then I would present students with a case and a handout. Then I would either divide students into groups or have them work individually. And then we would have a discussion of the product of their work. When students worked individually, we would be looking mostly at contemporary examples of political communication, a speech by a politician, a televised ad, excerpts from a debate, a television interview, an op-ed that Vladimir Putin wrote on the New York Times after the US made clear their position on an invasion of Syria. When students would work in teams, I would present them with scenarios. So here is a campaign you need to run, and here is some information about the people you need to target and the people you need to persuade. How are you going to go about doing that? There's going to be an interview between a politician and a journalist. You are one team that does the preparation for the politician. How are you going to respond to the questions that you're going to get? Another team does the preparation for the journalists. What questions are you going to ask and what kind of answers do you expect? And students would be given background information that most of the times would be fictional but realistic, So they wouldn't be asked to parrot something that has been going on in the next few days, but to imagine how they would face a different challenge that is nonetheless realistic and plausible. Then they would basically be asked to make it happen. So the team that has done the journalist's preparation would do the interviewing, and the team that has done the politician's preparation would do the answering to the interviews. And we would see it play out, and then we would have a conversation about how this played out. I'm going to give you two examples of activities that I think exemplify well the kind of work we did. One was an individual activity and the other with a group discussion at the end, and another was a group exercise. So the first one of the topics of the course is what we call political public relations. So how politicians try to interact with journalists and media professionals in order to achieve the best media coverage. Now, one of the simple rules of political public relations is if you're being asked a question that you don't like, answer the question you do like. And another simple rule is repeat. Don't get sidetracked by the questions that the journalist is asking you, and don't be ashamed of repetition, because even if the journalists have heard it a million times, the audience hasn't. All right? So these are basic rules that we teach in courses about how politicians try to, if you will, manipulate, if you will, get the most out of media coverage. Now, there was an episode a few years ago in this country that made the rounds in media coverage around the world. Ed Miliband gave an interview when he was asked about a strike in public sector unions. He basically gave the exact same answer, almost verbatim, 5 times to 5 different questions to a reporter that was interviewing him. The line was, "These strikes were wrong," and then he went on repeating 6 or 7 carefully constructed phrases in a very consistent way, but the questions were different. Now, Ed Miliband, in doing that, was applying a classic political public relations strategy, which is ignore the question and repeat. The problem was that instead of, instead of only having a snippet of the interview broadcast on the evening news, which is the way usually these interviews end up, the full video footage of the interview was posted online, and it became viral, and it became a big embarrassment for Ed Miliband because he looked like he was, either not thinking about the answers or trying to manipulate the media coverage, which in a way is what he was trying to do. So I tried to leverage on this very particular and strange case by showing it to students and then asking them, without telling them why we were seeing this, asking them, what do you think happened? Is Ed Miliband not careful enough not to think about how to answer to different questions? Or why are we seeing this interview? And students gradually started to try to throw out some explanations, like maybe he wanted to make sure that people understood, or maybe he wants to show that he doesn't respect the journalist enough. And obviously those were not the answers I wanted. But gradually, students came to understand that this was actually an episode of political public relations gone wrong. It was also interesting to see how they understood why we got to see the full footage, and which is because we no longer operate in a media system where you only negotiate with a TV producer for a 10-second soundbite on the evening news, but everything that gets filmed can become public and can become visible to millions of people. So that was one example where, by showing a particular and extravagant case, I got students to think about what is behind the media coverage they get. Behind every snippet of politician's statement that they see on the news, there is probably something going on that is not unlike this very strange case of a politician giving the same answer 5 times. The other case I would mention is, this was more than 6 months ago, when the US Democratic and Republican primaries were going on, and at the time it looked like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump would be the nominees, which actually is what happened. But at the time, they were not fighting each other. They were fighting their opponents for the nomination within their parties. So what we did is we saw a couple of commercials for each candidate and one extract of a speech for each candidate. Students were divided into groups. One group was to be the strategist for the Donald Trump general election campaign, and another group had to devise a strategy for the Hillary Clinton general election campaign. I told students, based on what you see here, based on what your candidate is saying right now, you need to imagine how the general election is going to look like when your candidate is not facing primary opponents, but he's facing Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, depending on which team people were part of. So we used an instrument which is called the message box, which is basically a 2x2 table which shows what you're saying about yourself as a candidate, what you're saying about the opponent, what the opponent is saying about herself, and what the opponent is saying about you. And it is a way for a campaign to understand where the race is going. Are you attacking your opponent on a weak point of him or her, or are you attacking your opponent on something where he or she are actually strong? Is your opponent attacking on a sweet spot, or is your opponent attacking you on something where you feel really strong? So each team came up with their own assessment of the campaign, and this was a campaign that was not happening at the moment. It was a campaign that we could predict how it was gonna unfold because the candidates were already there, but they were not campaigning for that particular race at the moment. And so students got to put themselves in the shoes of a campaign strategist, think about not only about your campaign but your opponent's campaign, and then when each team revealed their plan, students were also incentivized to look at whether they would want to rethink some of their strategy based on what their opponent was doing, which is exactly what campaigns are about. You have your grand plans about what you want to do, but then at the end of the day, it's not only a question of what you do, but also a question of what your opponents do. So by doing that, I was trying to get students to get immersed in very chaotic and complicated realities such as campaigns, where you need to make decisions, you need to stick by your decisions, but you also need to assess what else is going on, what your opponent is doing, and be nimble to adjust your priorities and your tactics in order to be as effective as possible. I was very pleased with the student feedback I got. Generally, in my teaching career, I've always got satisfactory feedback that I was very happy with. And every time you change, you're always worried that some people might like it, some people might not like it. But in the student evaluations, all of them agreed that the course was stimulating, that the seminars were stimulating, that they could learn not only from me but from themselves, which is one of the reasons why I arranged these activities in this way, so that they could actually discuss and learn and work in teams. They used words like stimulating, they used words like exciting. They loved the fact that it was about contemporary issues. One of the challenges, textbooks get very quickly out of date in the field of political communication and politics more generally. So the fact that we could work on something that was happening or had happened very recently not only allowed them to connect their knowledge to contemporary reality, but also to see how it was relevant and how it could be applied, and also to take that critical step between the academic knowledge and the practical application of the academic knowledge, which is a very difficult thing to do, I think, especially at an undergraduate level. So they all were very, very positive about the level of involvement that the activities ensured, the level of hands-on approach that we were using, and the fact that it was contemporary and up-to-date and salient to them, which ensured that they could all speak about it, that there was no need to remind them what is it that we're talking about, because it was in the news, it had happened very recently, and so it was something that everybody could relate to.